We are here live from Paraty, the 11th FLIP, International Festival of Literature from Paraty with Aleksandar Hemon. That's correct, the pronunciation?
That is very good.
And it's really a huge honor to have a National Book Award winner.
No, I'm not a winner. I was in the running. I was shortlisted.
Really? So I read the wrong.
That's right. But keep spreading the rumor.
And also a writer that did something really hard and really impressive. That's writes in a different language from his original language. That's English. And there's a huge tradition of, not huge tradition, but a stellar tradition. Some writers like Conrad and Nabokov and Beckett that did this leap from one language to another language, from one culture to another culture. And with Aleksandar Hemon is not really changed from Sarajevo to the American landscape, because he keeps writing about his past in Sarajevo, in novels and essays, and just in another language. So first thing I would like you to talk a little about how this happened, how it happened to you write in English.
Well, in the early 90s, more than 20 years ago now, I was in Chicago in the United States. When the war in Bosnia started, I had not planned to stay in Chicago or the United States at the time. But when the war started and the siege of Sarajevo started, and I'm from Sarajevo, I decided to stay in the United States. And I'd been a writer. I'd worked as a journalist, and I'd written poetry and some stories and was published a little bit. I was in my 20s back then. So I considered myself to be a writer. But when I found myself in the United States, I could not write in Bosnia because the war was going on, and I could not feel the connection with the language because it was spoken and used by people who were under siege and killed. And I couldn't write in English at the time. So I decided to enable myself to write in English. So I started reading a lot and making notes, listing words that I didn't know and going back to them, and used the Oxford English Dictionary for an advanced learner most of the time. And I gave myself an arbitrary goal of 3 years to enable myself to write a story in English, a publishable story in English. Actually, the deadline was 5 years, but I wrote a first story after 3 years of working to find a way to write in English. And this was in '95, so ever since I've been writing in English. I went back to writing in Bosnian too in 1996, so I've been writing both in English and Bosnian since then, although I do not write fiction for some reason in Bosnian.
There's a trend of people comparing you to Nabokov, and natural is really an easy way of comparing. Some Russian immigrant comes to Paris, then to the United States, and decides to write in English, and you too. But my surprise was that reading about you, you learned English reading Lolita. Or this is correct? Reading
well, it's a
word for word.
It's a simple and romanticized version of the story. I had known enough English to communicate with people when I came for the strip in the United States. And I could even read newspapers in English at the time. But using a language for talking with people, when you do not know the word and you try to find the right word, and I can ask you for help. How do you say these things? I've been doing this in Brazil all day long. How do you say good night? In Portuguese, you can, ask people to help you with this. When you're writing a story, you cannot do that. The reader would not stand for that. And also, the way I wanted to write and still want to write requires precision in language. I need to know all the possibilities so that I could choose the right one. So this is what I didn't have. I did not learn to speak English reading Lolita, but I would read Lolita and pick up the words, so I would expand this range of choices for words. And of course, Nabokov's vocabulary is immense. It's to this day, it's very impressive to me how anyone could, not non-native speaker, but anyone can have so many words. So between Shakespeare and Nabokov, That's as good as it gets, really. So that, and I didn't also, I read Lolita, reread Lolita and underlining words and then making lists of words so I could acquire the language in which I wanted to write. But I also read all other books. I reread books that I had read in my native language, and I found new books to read, and I read a lot constantly. I enrolled in graduate school with the sole purpose of reading 8 hours a day. And so to me, reading was and is the way to acquire language for writing. I've never met a writer who was not a voracious reader.
Yes.
They do not exist.
Do not exist.
So to the reading and writing, it's a continuous activity. They're just two sides of the same coin, as the cliche goes.
And I remember Paris Review interview of Nabokov, and you're talking about the luxury of the language of Nabokov. A lot of words, different words, and he was talking about his difficulties writing English. And the interviewer tells him that he has a really rich language, and he uses English with really profound fluency. And he tells to the interviewer that he lacks the small words of going from his house to the bakery.
Right.
And that's the words that makes he suspicious about writing in English and seeing himself as. And do you have this?
No, I don't. Nabokov, I mean, I love him, and it's unfair to Nabokov to be compared,
really?
For me to be compared to him, because he wrote 40 books and I wrote a few. He also had an English nanny and went to Cambridge, and so it was gentlemanly to diminish his greatness in front of others. I don't have a need to diminish my greatness because I'm not all that great, so I don't have to deal with that. But he was also operating in academic circles and sort of rarefied circles of, at best, New England intellectuals, as it were. And I worked minimum wage jobs when I started living in Chicago, and then had jobs that required, for instance, canvassing for Greenpeace, that required talking to people a lot, face to face, where I had to forego my self-consciousness and not worry whether they would think of me as a foreigner. Then I started playing football in Chicago, and you play football, I still play football with a large number of immigrants and a few Americans too. And you see not only the whole range of experiences, there are people from Brazil and people from Eastern Europe, and I played with the goalie from Tibet, among other places, and to this day there are people from all over. So to me, I go every day and use the words. I go to the bakery every day and talk to people in my neighborhood, and go and play football and talk to people in my neighborhood, and I also talk to billionaires in Chicago sometimes, not as often, and I spend some time talking to people who come from the academic circles. To me, one of the great advantages of my life and American life in general, perhaps, but my life in particular in Chicago, is that I can cover the whole range.
Yeah.
I have played football with illegal Mexican immigrants who go home and then cross the border at night. The coyotes take them over. And I've talked to them, had conversations about how they cross the border. And I've talked to billionaires in Chicago, members of the family that own hotels and museums, or finance building museums and so on. And to me, that's the beauty. For a writer, that's a great advantage. I don't care particularly about millionaires. I'm much closer to the illegal immigrant. But as a writer, to have the whole range of human experience, and so you can talk and ask questions to all kinds of people, that to me is beautiful. So when I started living in Chicago, that was always my goal, is to be able to talk to as many people as possible.
And that reflects somehow in your English, where you...
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I read a lot, and much of my English comes from that. I still do read a lot. I read constantly in all kinds of things, cereal boxes, on nutritional information cereal boxes, I read that because it's there. I also read books, history books and fiction. But also I talk to people every day. I do use a barber, although you cannot tell from my hairdo, but I've been going to the same barber for 16 to 18 years. They're friends. And so I go there, it's in my neighborhood, and they tell me gossip. They tell me what happened to this guy who came over to have a haircut after they closed the shop. and I get this daily information about, you know, human life from the areas that I don't really, you know, I'm not a barber, so I talk to my barber to try to imagine and understand what a barber's life would be. And he's a friend of mine now, so we get to talk a lot.
There were something like 2 years ago, Alice from the New Yorker, they made a special fiction issue about young American writers. And what surprised me, it's almost half of them were not born in the United States. And they wrote beautifully the language, and there's this mark of the immigrant writer, people from immigration that immigrate.
Well, I think that very soon, and perhaps it's already the case, but very soon that will not be particularly worthy of mention.
Okay.
Certainly not in the United States. Okay. Because the English language is such that you can have access to it from anywhere. After all, we're in Brazil here and we're speaking in English without translation. But it also the way that the United States works, this world works, the immensity of migration all over the world allows people to have access to the English language, and not just the English language. I have met Bosnians who have written and published books in French and Norwegian and German, and I'm sure some Italian too, I think. And these are just Bosnians. But you add all the refugees who might find themselves in one of the Western countries and quickly acquire language to write in, and then all the people who are the first generation, perhaps, whose parents brought them over when they were 3 or 4. And so there's this change in the concept of native language or writing in a native language that is happening as we speak right now. That it is perfectly acceptable and normal to be writing in a language that is not your native language. And not only it's normal, but that your migrant experience is not a mark of shame, but it has entered mainstream culture, as is the case in the New Yorker, with the New Yorker, is that it allows you access to a particular area of human experience that is not available to native speakers. Because however you bend it, not just in literature, but in many areas, immigration, migration, displacement, movement of populations all around the world, this is what marks this historical moment. It's happening all the time in various classes, various peoples, various continents, or various distances rather, from one continent to another, or within the same continent. So Europe is all about that. It is people coming from, since the unification, then the wars in Bosnia, and then the war in Kosovo, and then the wars in other parts of the world that brought the refugees to Europe. Europe is all about a cultural and linguistic mess and sorting it out, where people speak 2 or 3 languages and write in 2 or 3 languages and are connected to 2 or 3 simultaneously cultural spaces. So this notion of a single cultural space, isolated cultural space with a single language, that's pretty much that. Within our lifetime, it will not be worth mentioning in a writer's biography that they write in a language that is not their native.
That's great.
That's what I think about it, yes.
You came here to party to be on a meeting with Binet. Well, what's the writer that you're talking?
Laurent Binet, the French writer.
Yes, about history and literature. And I read in an interview that you talk that first makes no sense the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, something that, and also that literature can go to places that history can't really, are not allowed to represent in when you have a historical narrative. So first, this quote is correct.
Where there are no words in Bosnian that are allowing for the distinction between fiction and non-fiction. There's no word for fiction, there's no word for non-fiction, and there are no equivalent words that would present the difference between fiction and non-fiction. So that my publisher and my translator, in fact, in Bosnia, in translating the most recent book, which here in the United States and here in Portuguese, I understand, could be qualified or described as nonfiction.
Yes.
She doesn't. We don't have the words for that. And because I knew that was the case, I was writing this book, and I knew that it would come up, the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and what I think about it. I realized that the overarching category for my work, and perhaps all of literature, is really storytelling. The closest term for this book, in my mind, my book of nonfiction, is true stories.
True stories.
So that I wrote them out of the same need to tell stories that drives my fiction writing. It's a limit and also an opportunity or an advantage of what we now call nonfiction, that these stories were true. That is, I did not have to make stuff up. And also that because true stories never belong to just one person, because they always touch other people, and so it's the truth, not just the story that you share with them. I had to run them by people who are involved in those stories. My sister, my friends, people who experienced things at the same time as I did. And so it's not that there's no difference between truth and untruth, between truth and lies, but rather in terms of literature, in terms of storytelling, the difference is really negligible in some ways. It's to a very large extent, the difference between nonfiction and fiction is a marketing trick.
Can you talk more about the book that's been translated now here? It's called the Book of My Lives.
That's
and why the plural, lives? I think that's really...
The book is a collection of non-fictional pieces that I've written over time. The oldest one, I think, is from 2000. And so I've been assembling this book in some ways for a long time. And one of the pieces, in fact, this is the oldest piece, it's called The Book of My Life. And initially, the title of the book was going to be The Book of My Life. As I was assembling this and working, editing book, I suddenly realized it's no longer one life. And so I changed the title. I had already submitted a manuscript to my agent and publisher, and I said the title is The Book of My Lives. For me, there are at least two lives: the life before and the life after the war, or the life during the war, after the start of the war. But also, what I've learned in working on this book and all other books, what really writing fiction and nonfiction taught me, is that we all contain multiple personalities and characters, and then try to harmonize them into some sort of semblance of oneness. Right? We believe or convince ourselves that there's something that we experience as psychological and moral continuity, so that I can imagine that, when I was a little boy, I was really the same person, just smaller. But it's not the case, and certainly not the case for someone who has been moving between countries and has experienced things, and like me, anyone who can divide the life into the before and the after. And where this is traumatic to a lot of people, and was traumatic to me at some point, I realized this is an advantage for a writer. But what does a fiction writer do but invent number of lives, so that you become every one of your characters, at least for the time while you're writing the book. And to be able to experience several lives simultaneously, that's an advantage to the writer. It took me a while to learn that what I had experienced at the time of the war as a kind of a psychological disintegration was, to some extent, and required a lot of work and getting around problems, that it was in some ways a liberation process. Suddenly I could be other people. When I was young, and young people do this, they always fight for the right to be themselves. Yes. And they want to figure out who they are, and then they want to maintain the right and fend off all of those who do not allow them to be themselves. But I just realized I can be myself, and that I can be all these other people. And to me, that was a great revelation. So the book, in some ways, addresses that, but in terms of nonfiction, these are the lives that I have actually lived, as it were, rather than just imagined.
Also, talking about cities, everything I read about you talks about how you deal with Chicago landscape and Chicago, the city of Chicago. And when I think about Chicago, I always think about a monumental writer, that's Bello, in The Adventures of March, and for me it's really. And how do you help him to rewrite the landscape of Chicago and imagination of people?
Well, there were other writers from Chicago, and so for Chicagoans and people in America, apart, and which is of course the major book from Chicago, apart from The Adventures of Augie March, there are other books that mark Chicago. People love Nelson Algren and also Studs Lonigan, the James T. Farrell book, which is an old one. And there are more recent books. Stuart Dybek is well loved and liked, and deservedly so. The thing with cities, the thing that I like about cities, is that they continuously change. And American cities perhaps more than any other cities, and perhaps even too much. But they constantly shift their shape. They constantly shift the way they understand themselves. People flow through cities. Unlike European cities, where it is very common and in fact expected for people to be born, to live, and work and die in the same city. In the United States, moving between cities is so common that if you stay in the city of your birth, you are likely to be perceived as a failure. Someone who has not been able or did not know how to explore the possibilities of other cities. Everyone wants to leave the city in which they were born. It's so contrary to my sensibility. But which is why I decided Chicago became an adopted hometown to me in some ways. And so I've lived in Chicago for more than 21 years now, and I've seen it change. I've seen the neighborhoods I know well change. I've seen other things change. To me, this is exciting, this shape-shifting. So that The Adventures of Augie March, the Chicago that is in that book, and of course it doesn't just take place in Chicago, it takes place all over the world. It is still present in Chicago, but there's also, some of it is unrecognizable. And you also have a sense that the Augie March would not understand and recognize the city as it is. But that is not necessary either. I mean, ideally we have a library of books that would be organized, a shelf of books that would talk about Chicago or any other city. And one of those books, I hope, would be mine.
I want to talk to you about a fabulous work that you do as editor of this series from the Dalkey Archie Press. I have the two first ones. That's the best of European fiction. And I think that maybe it's a Herculean work to assemble all these writers from all Europe. Can you talk about this project?
Well, I've done 4 of those anthologies. And the Dalkey Archive Press, which is the biggest translation publishing press in the United States, which is really saying it's the tallest midget in the United States. And it's most importantly, it's a non-for-profit publisher. So they can undertake a risky project of organizing the ways in which we would get information about writers. We would have translators translate their works, and then I would get to pick writers from each, a story or a submission from each country from a pile of submissions. The way they did that, I will not get into details, but for each published story, there were 2 or 3, sometimes more, unpublished stories from the same language. They found a way to finance translation from languages like Lithuanian and Latvian and Bosnian and languages that do not really have translators who could live translating from those languages. I think I learned in the process of editing that there are only 3 translators from Lithuanian in the United States, and they were not building big houses from that work. But the project allowed them to keep, and they, of course they do not translate only from Lithuanian, but the project allowed them to work in that language and get paid for that. And then we would publish one story from Lithuania, or France for that matter, but there would be those others that were not published. They would still be available, so they would reach agents, they would reach magazines, they would reach publishers, and so on. So that for in each book there were about 40 published pieces, and around the book there would be nearly 150, or between 120 and 150, or actually 100 pieces that were unpublished. So it was a project that generated translation. Everything grew out of it. And a lot of those translations are still circulating, and some of the books were published all over the world because of the piece that was published in the anthology. Because, as we mentioned earlier, the English language is the lingua franca of the modern times. Everyone speaks it. It allows, say, Norwegian publishers to read a Romanian or Macedonian author in English, and then buy a book and translate it from Macedonian to Norwegian. A Macedonian writer, after his piece was published in the book, his book ended up being published in 30-some countries, because the editors in those countries, or at least some of those countries, could read the English translation.
There's a question from the audience here, Márcio Lopes, do Recife, and he asking that, do you know or have ever read some Brazilian writers? How do you know Brazilian literature?
I cannot say that I'm very familiar with Brazilian literature. I have a friend, Amilcar Beteka Barbosa, who's a young Brazilian writer I met in the United States. And we spent time in Writers' Colony and played ping pong. And then he lived in Lyon. I saw him in Lyon, and we stay in touch. I know Clarice Lispector, but she's, from some years ago. But the contemporary literature, I'm afraid I am not familiar, and one of the reasons I want to come, and I'm happy that I'm here, is that I will have a chance to learn more about the contemporary Brazilian literature. And now I know you.
Thank you. You told before that you started writing again in Bosnian and not really returning to the language. But how is to come back to Sarajevo? Do you ever come back to Sarajevo?
I started writing the column again in Bosnian, and I never really stopped writing after those 3 years that I didn't write in any language, on either language. I go to Sarajevo often. I haven't been there since March of 2011, but I will go later this year, and I constantly stay in touch. One of the advantages of this technology is that you can stay in touch. You can Skype. One of the things I did in Bosnia, partly, I wrote a script with a Bosnian film director who lives in Sarajevo. We started writing in Bosnian and then switched to English for some reason. But we Skyped. She lives in Sarajevo, and I live in Chicago, and we met a couple of times and spent some time together in the same room. But out of 3 years that we spent writing the script together, most of the time we were Skyping. And this is amazing, I mean, in more ways than one. It wasn't just exchanging gossip, which I also do with people in Sarajevo by way of Skype or email, but it allowed us for creative possibilities that were not available before. If we were writing letters to each other with script drafts, it would have taken 25 years to write the script. So to go to Sarajevo, it's not just to go to a nostalgic space that I remember from many years ago. I go to see a friend I work with. Okay. Friends that I stay in touch with, and I'm up on the gossip, and I know who's doing what, and who's dating who, and who is fighting with who, and so on. So the moment I land, I can fit in instantly.
So maybe this is the last question, and my last question is, what you're working now? What's the next project? What are you doing now creatively?
Well, it's a strange thing to ask a writer. The way I feel is that I'm working on various failures right now. All the projects that might not come off. And in the meantime, I'm also working on some articles and non-fiction pieces, one of which is about football, pickup football, that I have to write for a football journal in the UK. Other than that, there are these it's too early to even call them novels. I have a lot of words in the computer that, if they reach a certain point, they will turn into a work of some meaning. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time. So it's too early to tell. If you are a writer, the way I think about it, if you're a writer, then you work on it all the time, but there's nothing to show for it until you submit a manuscript. It's all, in the air. You cannot you cannot touch it until it's done. So I have a lot of projects, but all of them are failing as we speak. But I might finish them, and I will probably.
So, Aleksandar, Hemon, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.
Enjoy your stay here in Brazil.
I will.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Obrigado.